Good morning. This hearing of the Subcommittee on Nutrition Oversight and Department Operations, entitled Examining the Proposed ABAWD Rule and Its Impact on Hunger and Hardship, will come to order. The purpose of today's hearing is to examine proposed changes to a long-standing USDA Able-Bodied Adults Without Dependents, or ABAWD, policy that will impact a significant number of SNAP recipients. Such a change demands careful and deliberate consideration. Today, we will have this long overdue conversation. On February 1st, I sent a letter to the Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue, outlining my serious concerns with the department's proposed rule on ABAWDs. The proposed rule included a 60-day comment period, which I do now understand has been extended for a few days. However, given the seriousness of this topic, I requested an extension on the comment period so that there may be more time to explore its potential impacts. The department rejected the request, and instead, Secretary Perdue responded to me by saying, and I quote, "The proposed rule would encourage broader application of the statutory ABAWD work requirement consistent with the administration's focus on fostering self-sufficiency and promoting the dignity of work. I believe these proposed changes support our mutual goal of improving the lives of those participating in SNAP," end quote. Well, Mr. Secretary, I disagree. The goal of improving lives is mutual. Your methods, though, are harsh, arbitrary, and mean. There is no dignity in taking food from the poorest and most vulnerable of our citizens. It is dishonest and immoral for anyone to assume or suggest that poor people do not want to work, especially—
Testing 1, 2, 3. Test 1, 2, 3. Hello, testing 1, 2, 3.
Especially if that work only pays an average of $125 per month. And before we go any further, I want to make it very clear. People want a hand up, not a handout, and it is insulting to suggest otherwise. The proposal before us fails to consider that unemployment is not the sole problem for ABAWDs. Many ABAWDs experience other hardships, including lack of housing, undiagnosed mental illness, learning disabilities, and poor health. The proposal before us makes clear this administration does not understand nor care about the lack of access or barriers and hardships that keep many from finding and securing long-term employment. The proposal also tells me the administration foolishly assumes everybody has the same access—
Testing 1, 2, 3.
the same access to resources needed to escape the cycle of poverty. If they just worked 20 hours a week, it would solve their problems and move them out of poverty magically. Lifting yourself up by your bootstraps only works if you have boots. What I want to know is what USDA actually knows about those who will be affected by this rule. Based on the report from our witnesses, Mathematica in particular, we are most likely dealing with the poorest of the poor. In fact, I'm still waiting on my request for information during last month's hearing with the Secretary, where I asked what percentage of ABAWD populations are veterans, homeless, have mental or physical limitations, or lack access to public transportation. Were any of these factors analyzed or data collected before the release of the proposed rule? Does the department even internally track this kind of relevant information to better inform its rulemaking and policy decisions? If they were, please present it to us. It's time we call this what it is: a rush to accomplish a conservative political wish list. If this was really about the dignity of work and efficiency of the program, we would wait to see the final results from the 2014 Farm Bill, which provided $200 million for 10 employment and training pilot projects. It is ill-advised to issue a rule without the supporting data or best practices learned from the pilots to better serve the ABAWD population. USDA estimates that 755,000 people will lose benefits and predicts a savings in federal spending on SNAP benefits of $7.9 billion over 5 years. What will happen to the 755,000 people? If the department is so eager to get people into jobs, will the department hire them? The unemployment rate in my district is 9.8%. Where are the jobs? My Republican colleagues love to talk about the surplus of jobs or low unemployment numbers, but we should remember that there's a skills gap at play within this population, and many ABAWDs live in smaller, rural communities where jobs are not as readily available. Was the skills gap taken into consideration during formulation of this proposed rule? Low unemployment rates do little to tell us whether jobless individuals in a specific geographical area lack the necessary skills to obtain gainful work in the community. However, the department proposes to limit existing state flexibility to submit a variety of credible resources and support materials to help tell the story of a Bureau of Labor Statistics unemployment rate. On this here. Okay. A low unemployment rate does not erase the existence of significant barriers to unemployment in our nation's poorest communities. Without the skills necessary to obtain gainful employment and meet SNAP work requirements, what other options are there for these individuals to put food on the table? I am very concerned about the added burden these proposed cuts to SNAP place on other low-income services and charities like food banks. Every time Republicans trot out calls for welfare reform, they argue the private sector will pick up the slack. Let me ask this. What does $7.9 billion in savings from SNAP mean if it increases the demand for other low-income programs or local charities that are already stretched thin? This proposed rule is nothing more than another attempt by the GOP and the Trump administration to reintroduce the thoughtless House Republican SNAP provisions that were rejected in the 2018 Farm Bill. We passed a bill. Please follow the law. The House and Senate passed a Farm Bill conference report by a historic 369 votes, and the President signed it without delay. Let's just follow the law. Rehashing failed policies is an affront to the democratic process and an utter waste of time. We have seen this administration and my colleagues reciting the same negative talking points about people who are on SNAP time and again, and I'm really very weary of it. Instead of proposing cruel and unsound ideas without merit, let's figure out how to help people in need. Our job is to do the most for those who have the least. Let's just follow the law. I would now turn to my colleague, my friend, the ranking member, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I do appreciate Ms. Fudge convening this hearing, and I want to thank our witnesses for their participation. You know, for me, an important foundation of all of this subcommittee's work on nutrition is, number one, that we all want to improve the lives of Americans who are facing hard times. I think that's obvious. Number two, that SNAP is an important poverty program. That's something worth maintaining, something worth holding up. And then number three, that work and education are a critically important, a necessary part of helping people realize opportunities to move out of poverty. And so each of us today on this dais is fighting for the same goal. Madam Chair mentioned that. We all want to see the lives of Americans improve. And a number of us on the broader Ag Committee on both sides of the aisle have experienced welfare programs, poverty programs on a personal basis. But whether we have or we haven't, we all want to make sure that we maintain an effective and efficient social safety net. And so we're going to disagree about the best way to do that, but the basic heart of the matter is intact. And as a country, we spend $1 trillion a year on 80 social safety net programs, and we want to make sure they work. We are a nation of giving. We want to be a nation of opportunity. And so able-bodied adults, you know, the ABAWD population, we've been talking about this population for a long time. I know there have been a lot of hearings that have addressed this issue, and I'm excited to have our witnesses today hit on them even more. But from the welfare reform efforts of 1996 to the Farm Bill discussions of 2018, for decades, this group and the broader Congress has been talking about ABAWDs. And I think we've made some progress. But nobody here would say that our work is done, and so I am excited to work together to try to find a way to do even better, to find data-driven solutions for how we can improve the lives of these ABAWDs. So you may have heard me say, because I say it a lot, that work has dignity, work is opportunity, work is an American value, that we all need help to achieve. And I'm excited to discuss today and in the future how we really can work with the administration, work with throughout Congress to try to make sure that able-bodied adults really do have a good pathway from welfare to work. And that's going to help us preserve these programs, this critically important SNAP program for our most in-need friends and our most in-need neighbors. As the chair alluded to, my side of the aisle has talked a lot about a record economy, record job openings, and I do think that gives us a special opportunity to help people move out of poverty and into work. So for that reason, I want to applaud Secretary Perdue and USDA in taking this regulatory action to make work an even more central component of this important program. These proposed rules, they really are intended, honestly intended, to help work-capable individuals seek new employment opportunities and be in a better position to realize their dreams. Now, some states have taken too much flexibility. They have taken too much liberty with the flexibility that Congress has given them. And I know that has been a bipartisan sentiment in the past, that both Democrat and Republican members of the Ag Committee have said that. And so I'm looking forward to working with my colleagues to right-size the amount of flexibility, to hold states accountable, and move more people off poverty. The term able-bodied, as we've talked about, is so key to this discussion. And I want to make sure that we are working to empower and not stigmatize the ABAWD population. Of course, Madam Chairman is exactly right that these folks have a certain number of challenges. There are barriers to unemployment, that is inarguable. But despite those barriers, with help, they can still seek employment. They can stabilize their income. They can move to a place of even greater personal autonomy. That's the American dream. I think about during the Farm Bill discussions, there was a video that came out, and I was a private citizen at the time, but I was captivated by the video. It was about Latasha, and she was a former ENT participant here in Washington. She completed a certification program back in 2012, has been working successfully since. Her story is a story that should make us all proud, and with help, with additional accountability, with states doing a better job of managing their programs, there can be thousands more Latashas out there realizing a better life. And I think we all know that just ignoring the need for improvement, ignoring the need for reform, doesn't really improve anybody's life. That's not leadership. And so let's work with SNAP recipients, let's work with this subcommittee, let's work with the administration to move even more people from welfare to work. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield and I welcome our witnesses.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson. I would ask that all members submit their opening statements for the record so that we can begin with our witnesses as quickly as possible. I'd like to introduce and welcome our witnesses. We would begin today with Karen Cunningham, Associate Director, Mathematica Policy Research, Washington, D.C. Mr. Shambaugh, Director, the Hamilton Project, Brookings Institution, Washington, D.C. Ms. Lisa Hamler-Fugitt, Executive Director, Ohio Association of Food Banks, Columbus, Ohio. And Mr. Sam Adolphson, Vice President of Executive Affairs, Foundation for Government Accountability, Naples, Ohio. Ms. Cunningham, you may begin. I would just bring your attention to the lighting system. The light will turn green when you begin. You will have 5 minutes to give your testimony. When you see the yellow light, it means you have 1 minute. When you see the red light, we would like you to conclude as quickly as possible. Thank you very much and welcome.
Chairwoman Fudge, Ranking Member Johnson, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. I am an Associate Director at Mathematica and have been conducting research on SNAP for government agencies for 18 years. I currently direct a project commissioned by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to develop rigorous and objective estimates of the effects of proposed changes to SNAP. Much of what I will present today is based on findings from that project. SNAP participants who are ages 16 to 59 do not have a disability and are not working at least 30 hours per week must register for work unless they meet certain criteria, such as caring for an incapacitated person. Work registrants who are ages 18 to 49 and don't live with a child must work an average of at least 20 hours per week or face a time limit of 3 months of benefits in a 3-year period. They are exempt from the time limit, however, if they participate in a qualifying employment and training program or other meaningful work activity, have a percentage exemption from the state agency, or live in a waiver area, an area for which the state agency requested and received a federal waiver from time limits because of high unemployment. USDA's proposed regulatory change would eliminate or modify some current waiver area criteria. For example, states would no longer be able to request a waiver for counties with overall unemployment rates less than 7%. Table 1 in my written testimony summarizes the proposed changes. According to USDA's regulatory impact analysis, among the SNAP participants who are ages 18 to 49 without a disability in childless SNAP households and in a waiver area in fiscal year 2016, about 3/4 would be newly subject to the additional work requirement and time limit. USDA further estimates that under the proposed changes, between 755,000 and 851,000 of these people would not meet the work requirements in 2020 and would therefore lose eligibility after 3 months. Mathematica used fiscal year 2017 SNAP quality control data to examine the characteristics of SNAP participants who would be affected by the proposed changes. Specifically, we focused on the estimated 1.2 million SNAP participants who lived in a waiver area, could be newly subject to time limits, and were not working at least 20 hours per week. Among these SNAP participants, 97% lived in poverty, and 88% lived in deep poverty, compared with 39% of other SNAP participants living in deep poverty. 11% were working, although less than 20 hours per week, and another 6% lived with someone else who was working. However, only 1/3 were living in SNAP households with any reported income. Among those, the average household income was $557 a month, 43% of the poverty level. The average monthly SNAP benefit was $181 per person. Finally, these SNAP participants were much more likely to live alone than other SNAP participants, 78% compared with 23%. The potential impact on these individuals would vary by their circumstances and state. SNAP participants in the 17 states without waiver areas would not be affected by the proposed changes. In other states, the state agency may offer slots in qualifying employment and training programs or percentage exemptions to participants who would otherwise face a time limit. In many states, however, some SNAP participants would be newly required to work an average of at least 20 hours per week or be subject to the time limit. Both SNAP participants' job readiness and the local labor market will affect SNAP participants' ability to find work. Although BLS estimates the national overall unemployment rate was 3.9% in 2018, some groups were less likely to find work. For example, the unemployment rate for young adults ages 20 to 24 was 6.9%, and the rate for African American men was 7%. Policy decisions should be informed by the best data available, and this proposed rule is no exception. Policymakers could gain a more complete picture of the likely effects of the proposed regulatory change if detailed information on the areas that would no longer qualify for a waiver were incorporated into state estimates of the people potentially affected. In addition, examining unemployment rates for subgroups of a state population would provide valuable insights into the availability of jobs for SNAP participants and the potential for some groups to experience a disproportionate impact from proposed changes. New data collection on the circumstances of people who lose eligibility for SNAP because of time limits also could help policymakers understand whether and how well policy objectives are being achieved. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for Mr. Adolphson. Obviously, you're not getting a yellow light for some reason, so when you see the red light, just please try to wrap up.
Chairwoman Fudge, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the Nutrition Subcommittee, thank you for the privilege of testifying. I was brought up in a household that believed in hard work. My dad was a landscaper, my mom cleaned houses. A job was a point of pride, and I can still remember getting that first paycheck from a tough day raking blueberries in rural Maine. For many of us, that's our story. Work is central to our lives. It provides dignity and purpose. The growth of our communities is built on people living this experience, living the American dream. And work is key to achieving the long-term goal of the food stamp program, lifting people out of poverty. That's why Congress and President Clinton passed bipartisan work requirements for able-bodied adults on food stamps in 1996. They recognized the power of work. And they were right. Where work requirements have been implemented, those leaving the program doubled their incomes in just 1 year. And they didn't just go to work in retail or fast food. They went back to work in more than 1,000 different industries. Now, these figures aren't extrapolations or anecdotes. Our experts studied the actual earnings of 600,000 able-bodied adults who left food stamps after work requirements were implemented in Florida, Kansas, and Arkansas. One young man in Arkansas, I'll call him Nolan, reported no income while on welfare, 0. After work requirements were implemented, Nolan soon left the program. Then Nolan got a job. Within 1 year, he was earning $63,000. And by the end of 2 years, he was making $93,000. Work requirements work. Unfortunately, for millions of able-bodied adults on food stamps, this isn't the experience at all. And government bears a big part of the blame. When I was chief operating officer of the Food Stamp Agency in Maine, before we reinstated work requirements, I had 1,000 state employees helping fill out food stamp applications, but no one helping fill out job applications. We were letting people like Nolan down. Government should be giving a hand up, not just a handout. The loopholes created at the federal agency level have gutted the 1996 law, allowing work to be waived across the country by gerrymandering areas and using old economic data. So I want you to remember two numbers, 2.6 million and 7.6 million. First, 2.6 million. There are 2.6 million able-bodied adults on food stamps who will be waived from the work requirement this year. And 3 out of 4 don't work at all. Second, 7.6 million. There are 7.6 million available jobs today and the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years. Employers are desperate for workers. To be clear, federal law allows waivers only when there are not enough jobs or unemployment is at least 10%. But just 23 of the 1,100 counties and cities that waive work requirements have unemployment at or above 10%. One California waiver county has 2.2% unemployment. And Ohio's waiver has more than doubled since 2017, even as its unemployment rate declined to near record low levels. Waivers from work shouldn't be so easy to get in the best economy in decades. And some have claimed that Congress rejected the type of changes proposed here by the Trump administration. But the bipartisan 2018 Farm Bill, like every other farm bill since 1996, reaffirmed the original work requirements. And it did not codify the current regulations that have allowed the waiver abuse. It's clear that the status quo does not reflect congressional intent. Even Chairman Colin Peterson correctly pointed out that the loopholes have allowed states to, quote, undermine federal law. The Trump administration has the authority and the duty to fix the regulation and return waivers to their original purpose of exempting only those individuals in truly economically depressed areas. The track record of work requirements is clear. They work. And when this rule is implemented, we can all be confident that hundreds of thousands of Americans, people just like Nolan, will move from welfare to work and experience their own American dream. Thank you. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Ms. Hamler-Fugitt.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairwoman Fudge, Member Johnson, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for convening this hearing today and inviting me to testify on the Trump administration's proposed rules related to unemployed or underemployed adults without dependents participating in the SNAP program. My name is Lisa Hamler-Fugitt, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Ohio Association of Food Banks, Ohio's largest charitable response to hunger. We distributed over 200 million pounds of emergency food last year in an attempt to fill the gap for hungry Ohioans. But SNAP provides 12 times as much food while infusing resources into local communities. The administration's proposed rule would limit access to SNAP for adults with very limited resources without improving their overall employment outlook or health outcomes. Based on my association's firsthand experience operating the SNAP Work Experience program, which provides services exclusively for clients required to find work under the current SNAP rules, I'm here to provide you with my perspective on the impacts that this proposed rule would have in Ohio. Currently, 38 of Ohio's 88 counties have waived SNAP time limits due to high unemployment. If the proposed rule were to take effect today, with a 7% threshold for waiver eligibility, only 3 Ohio counties would qualify for the waiver. These 3 counties account for less than 1% of Ohio's current SNAP population, meaning that nearly all would be subject to the time limit if the proposed rule went into effect. Unfortunately, we know from our extensive experience that those subject to the time limit have profound barriers to employment. The Work Experience program conducts in-depth, comprehensive client assessments to determine the client employability and identify barriers to employment. Over the first 2 years of our program, we completed over 5,000 in-depth interviews and gathered information on 5,500 self-reported employment and skills assessments. Our results represent the state's most comprehensive and up-to-date data, information available on this population. Our single largest and biggest takeaway is the term ABAWD is a complete misnomer for who this population is. 1 in 3 clients reported a physical or mental limitation ranging from back injuries to heart conditions to depression to PTSD. Many participants appear to be marginally or functionally illiterate and likely experiencing significant learning disabilities. Additionally, many clients appear to have social and/or cognitive impairments, difficulty communicating, and a tendency to engage in repetitive behaviors, all signs of autism spectrum disorder. We believe that there are high levels of undiagnosed autism and other developmental disabilities in this population. 1 in 3 clients have no high school diploma or GED. Nearly half reported that they do not have reliable transportation, and whether through a personal vehicle, public transit, or ride sharing with family or friends. And 60% report that they do not have a current valid driver's license. About 1/3 of our clients had felony convictions, a stigma which can follow someone for a lifetime, even if their release is meant to suggest that they have been rehabilitated. Many of our clients are parents or caregiver with responsibilities that can serve as barriers to employment. And 1 in 4 of our clients had children that were not in their custody, and many spend time parenting those children on a regular basis while the custodial parent works. Additionally, 1 in 10 reported they are caregivers for family, friends, or relatives. In addition to these issues, many of our clients face other challenges which makes finding employment difficult. We serve hundreds of individuals who have aged out of the foster care system only to find themselves living in homeless shelters with friends or on the street. Many other clients are experiencing challenges like homelessness and language barriers. These individuals face daunting challenges in finding employment, even when general unemployment rates are low, which is exactly why Congress gave states the option to waive the time limit in areas where there were insufficient jobs for those who were subject to the requirement. I'd like to share just one story of a client, a Somalian refugee who relies on public transportation and requires an interpreter to fulfill his mandatory work requirements. Due to paperwork error, he was mistakenly cut off his SNAP benefits and was sent to our local food pantry network to get food. Until his case could be sorted out. Sadly, this case is not unique. Tens of thousands of real people like him are slipping through the cracks. We know all too well that harsh and arbitrary time limits are misguided and only increase hunger and hardship. The proposed rule would shift the burden of providing food from the federal government onto cities, states, and local charities like mine. It would be harmful to the local economies, grocers, retailers, and the agriculture community by reducing the amount of SNAP benefits and dollars available in economic activity.
Please wrap up.
Closing, most importantly, the rule sidesteps the will of Congress, which rejected these changes when it enacted the 2018 Farm Bill. We hope that we can work together to stop these harmful policies from taking effect, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Mr. Shambaugh.
Chairwoman Fudge, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to join in this important discussion. My name is Jay Shambaugh. I serve as the director of the Hamilton Project, a senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution, and as a professor of economics at George Washington University. I'm here to provide evidence regarding SNAP, a program that lifts millions of Americans out of poverty, reduces food insecurity, improves economic security, and acts as a crucial fiscal automatic stabilizer. Research shows that SNAP is a highly effective program. It also shows that work requirements keep people out of the SNAP program, but have little or no impact on work. The proposed rule takes a number of steps to reduce the flexibility of states in using waivers or exemptions from work requirements. The proposed rule and its impact analysis are correct that the changes will reduce SNAP participation, but provide literally zero evidence that the changes would increase employment. Agencies may issue regulations when there's compelling public need and when benefits outweigh costs. In my remaining time, I would like to highlight 3 areas where the proposed rule fails to meet this standard. First, in theory, work requirements are in place to motivate those who do not want to work to do so. But very few ABAWDs on SNAP, 1.4%, are, quote, not interested in working. The vast majority are, in fact, in the labor force. However, their labor market experience, as it is true for many low-paid workers, is highly unstable, as participants tend to cycle in and out of full-time employment. In research I've conducted with my Brookings colleague Lauren Bauer, which has been provided to the committee, we find that 75% of ABAWDs over 2 years are labor force participants. Over 1/3 of those in the labor force would satisfy the work requirements at some points in time, but not at other points in time over that 2-year window, almost as many as would consistently satisfy the work requirement. Of those who generally work but sometimes do not, the majority are not working due to, quote, work-related reasons. That is, they lost a job or couldn't get enough hours in a given month to satisfy the work requirement. We also find that the title able-bodied is a misnomer for some of this group, as 80% of the ABAWDs who are not in the labor force at all over the 2-year window list health and disability as the reason they are not working. These are people who should be eligible for exemptions but could fail to receive them. Based on the characteristics of the targeted population, the federal government should not be impeding states' ability to apply for waivers from work requirements in areas where there is evidence of a lack of sufficient jobs or limiting states' ability to use exemptions to address individual cases. Second, the proposed rule fails to consider the effect of the proposed changes in the face of a deteriorating economy. Consider that when the economy was shedding 300,000 jobs a month in 2008, states successfully applied for waivers to work requirements statewide or for distressed regions using geographies and indicators that USDA would deem invalid under the proposed rule. Our analysis provided to the committee demonstrates that the rule would have reduced waiver eligibility early in the Great Recession. In 2008, the state of Ohio was granted a work requirement waiver for the entire state for 2 years. By the proposed rule, Ohio could not apply for the statewide waiver. The 20% rule they used would be compromised by an excessively high unemployment rate floor, and the extended time period granted would be denied. Our submitted analysis shows that the proposed rule takes a waiver system that is already too slow to respond to an economic downturn and makes it worse. Lastly, the goal of the proposed rule is to incentivize work, but the consequences of the rule is to, in fact, incentivize ABAWDs to reside in distressed economies if they want to avoid time limits. Work requirements are applied to places of residence. Individuals wanting to move to places with a stronger economy would risk their food resources because they would suddenly face work requirements. Reducing the statewide or geographic grouping waivers could lower labor mobility. In conclusion, The evidence recommends against expanding work requirements, whether through restricting states' ability to apply for waivers or extending exposure to sanction to parents or older Americans. There are better ways to encourage work within the SNAP program, such as adjusting the earnings disregard, expanding wraparound services, and improving training and placement. There are also better ways to improve waiver eligibility, such as automatically granting waivers in the event Congress authorizes emergency unemployment compensation. These reforms would strengthen and support SNAP as well as the economy. And I'm also happy to take any questions.
Thank you all for your testimony. We will now begin questioning. Members will be recognized for questioning in the order of seniority for members who were here at the beginning of the hearing. After that, members will be recognized in order of their arrival. I would now yield 5 minutes to Mr. McGovern.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your testimony. Last Congress, Republicans held 23 hearings on SNAP, I disagree with Mr. Johnson. We didn't talk about this issue at all. In fact, they intentionally avoided a hearing on this. I requested a hearing, and it was never happened. And I now know why, because bottom line is the ABAWD population is a complicated population. It doesn't fit into a nice, neat category that you can stigmatize, that you can demonize. This is a population that includes returning veterans, people with limited educational experiences, some who are aging out of foster care, people who have undiagnosed mental illnesses, people who live in rural areas who don't have access to transportation. I mean, there are lots and lots of issues involved in this population. And I should also point out for the record that the majority of able-bodied adults on SNAP right now actually work. They earn so little, they still qualify for SNAP. And this notion that somehow this population is just lazy and just wants to benefit from this benefit, I will remind people that the average SNAP benefit is about $1.40 per person per meal. So it doesn't provide very much of anything. I asked Secretary Perdue when he was here in February to provide me the Democratic data that the USDA used to justify this new rule. I have received nothing to date. Maybe it's lost in the mail, but hopefully we will get that at some point. But my frustration is we passed a farm bill, it was a bipartisan farm bill. It rejected all the cruel provisions that were contained in the House bill, but it passed overwhelmingly when it came back to the House. And yet we have the administration ignoring what Congress decided, which is, I think, which is frustrating. I want to also, point out that, about in terms of the consequences of what the administration is trying to do. I mean, Maine tightened up on the work requirements. There was an article in the Washington Post in May of 2017. Let me read the beginning of it. It said, for a period last year after he lost his food stamps, Tim Keefe, an out-of-work and homeless Navy veteran, used his military training to catch, skin, and eat squirrels, roasting the animals over an open fire outside the tent he pitched in frigid Augusta, Maine. The new additions to Keefe's diet resulted from a decision by state authorities to tighten work requirements for the recipients of the social safety net, forcing the 49-year-old who lost his job at a farm equipment factory because of an injury off the food stamp rolls. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that can happen if we are not thoughtful about how we approach this issue. Yeah, we want to help people get into the workforce. We got to be investing in worker training, education, transportation. There are a whole bunch of things we should be doing, not cutting off their benefit because they find themselves in a difficult circumstance. I mean, I don't know how cutting off somebody's SNAP benefit is going to make it easier for them to get to a job where there's no transportation, or somebody who, again, has an undiagnosed mental illness, how that's going to help them get into the workforce. This is a simple-minded approach to a complicated problem. And it is, I believe it's part of this, it's red meat to the right-wing base who just never tires of demonizing this population. Let me ask Ms. Hamler-Fugitt, Ms. Cunningham, Mr. Shambaugh. I mean, I understand that a lot of your work has explored the complexities that arise from ABAWDs and low-income workers. Just for the record again, I mean, do you believe that low-income persons who work less than 20 hours a week do so by choice, that this is something they desperately want to do, or is it because of disadvantages?
To the chair, to the congressman, You know, today in America, a job doesn't mean a living. There are people that work and they work hard, but unfortunately in the current economy, that jobs don't provide full-time benefits. So the folks who are part of our program, they work, they want a job. I would also point out that we've done longitudinal studies of the leavers in our program. What we found is that when they do work, they generally work less than 30 hours a week for about $10 an hour with no benefits, and the average length of employment is 79 days, which is very interesting. 79 days would not trigger their eligibility for unemployment compensation. SNAP is a hunger lifeline for these individuals. A hungry worker is not a healthy worker, is not a productive worker.
I would just say, Congressman, not only do they want to work, but the evidence shows that most of them do work. And so most of them are cycling in and out of jobs, and the small portion who are not cycling in and out of jobs typically face significant barriers, health and otherwise, to work.
Quickly.
So I examine evidence, and excuse me. So it is true that we know that, as you mentioned, that ABAWDs, that SNAP participants cycle in and out of work, that time limits can, well, to directly answer your question, yes, I believe people want to work, and the evidence shows that most of them do work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
At some point.
Expired. Ranking Member Johnson, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Adelson, remind me, you mentioned you would analyze 600,000 ABAWDs in maybe 3 states. What were those 3 states?
Florida, Kansas, and Arkansas.
So in Florida, Kansas, and Arkansas, I mean, did your research indicate that there were SNAP recipients who had learning disabilities?
Well, by definition, an ABAWD is not disabled, but then the department, when they intake that person, particularly when the requirement's in place, will screen them for those types of barriers to make sure that they're directed to a place where they can get assistance with those.
So in Florida, Kansas, and Arkansas, were there SNAP recipients who were not fully literate?
I think that's probably likely. With 600,000 sample size, there were people that had issues that the department would work with them on to help them get back to work.
So in Florida, Kansas, and Arkansas, do you believe that there were SNAP recipients within your studied population who were caregivers for family members at home?
If they're actually responsible for the care of a child, they wouldn't be considered an ABAWD, so they wouldn't have been in that population.
So in Florida, Kansas, and Arkansas, do you believe that there were returning veterans within the studied population?
Certainly.
Do you believe within Florida, Kansas, and Arkansas that within the studied population there would be people who lacked access to reliable transportation?
Yes, there certainly would be. For the folks that left the program, they would have had to earn more income and then come off the program, because if they lack transportation and therefore cannot get to a job or training, they wouldn't have been in the group that we studied that left the program, because they would be exempt from the work requirement.
So I guess I'm a little confused, sir, if the populations within those states, I mean, they sound an awful lot like the populations in my states, and an awful lot like in my state, an awful lot like the populations in the states that the other witnesses described. I thought you said that there were successes for those populations that moved off the program. Did I misunderstand you?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's what's concerning about the way the waivers operate right now, is you have states doing very well with implementing the work requirement fully, in Florida, for example, and then you go to California and you have nearly 1 million people who have no work requirement. They're similar populations, they're similar income levels, they're the same age, same type of household situation. So the waiver makes for a very uneven application of the program rules.
So this has worked in some states. Is that what your research indicates?
Absolutely. It's been very effective.
So give me a sense of the types of supports that exist, things that states can do to help ABAWDs find meaningful employment.
Sure. There's a whole number of things. The federal government funds employment and training, a portion of it at 100%. States can get a 50-50 match for things like job search, education, job training. They can get funding for transportation. They can even buy equipment, like things like boots, if they need those for their job. And so states really can be very hands-on in helping people. The challenge is when you don't have the requirement in place, it also waives the requirement for the government to help them. They're simply sending them the benefit month after month, maybe checking in once a year for recertification, but they never really engage with them to find out where they can help.
Well, this is a population that clearly does have challenges, and no one should dispute that. I think you did a nice job sort of explaining that in the states you studied, there were people who had challenges. And I know my friends, I mean, Patty, who works as a retail clerk in Mitchell, who has some, I think, serious barriers. I think Mike, I think Paul, my friends who work in Mitchell, they have, I think, some challenges that I don't have. They have found meaningful employment. It is a meaningful part of their life. I think it's important that we remember that nobody is denigrating these folks. Nobody is suggesting that their path forward is easy. I think we are called to do an even better job than we're doing in helping them, and work is a critically important part of that process. I want to thank you for your research, sir. I yield back, ma'am.
Thank you. Ms. Adams is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the ranking member as well, and to the individuals who are here testifying. Thank you. Before I begin, I just want to reiterate that USDA is unilaterally changing rules around requirements for ABAWDs, despite Congress's negotiating a farm bill at the end of 2018, which explicitly avoids changing these requirements. And while North Carolina does not currently have a waiver, lawmakers in my state are assessing the need to authorize waivers for some counties that meet current requirements. But you know, because states can do, doesn't mean they will do or that they are able to. But I'm deeply concerned that the proposed changes will take away needed flexibility for my state to help communities and individuals who are struggling with unemployment, opioid addiction, and other barriers to work. Ms. Hamler-Fugitt, Mecklenburg County is a part of my district. It's an area with a strong economic and population growth, and even in our county, we have more than 7,500 ABAWD individuals who are unable to find work, full-time work, and they are receiving SNAP benefits. So if you could imagine the countless regions, especially in rural areas, that have seen years of stagnant growth and continue to have high unemployment, the lack of access to work and the chronic barriers to work that many of these individuals face are some of the reasons that USDA estimates that 755,000 people will lose food assistance. And so the rule will really force people who haven't been able to find work to enroll in ET or somehow find work when it's been impossible before. So with your experience in this space, do you think that it makes sense to ask E&T programs to do more than double the enrollment and programming with no funding? And what do you think the impacts will be to the quality of training?
To Congresswoman Adams, I can assure you that based on our firsthand experience in Ohio, that slots just don't materialize. You have to have an infrastructure that is set up by the county or the state that does require funding as well to provide these services, and then the support services to get individuals into those work and training slots and ensuring that if they are available, that they're being trained for jobs that are currently available. It is a very expensive endeavor, and I've just done some numbers based on Ohio. If Ohio were to lose its current waivers in 35 counties, and as estimating that about 75,000 individuals would have to have a slot made available to them, the cost associated with that would be about $600 million. On average, the cost of a good employment and training program varies from $4,500 on the low end to about $12,000 on the high end.
Thank you very much. Let me just move on to ask Ms. Cunningham and Mr. Schomburg. According to the National Education Association, more than 2.5 million children are being raised by their grandparents or other relatives, because families are dealing with parental alcohol, substance abuse issues, and others. So as a result, they face obstacles in securing an exemption from ABAWD time limits. So how do you see this rule impacting those struggling with opioid and other forms of addiction, and do you expect that there'll be unexpected consequences for the children? This is to Mr. Schomburg and Ms. Cunningham.
Well, I think as has already been mentioned today, we know that there are people who are in the ABAWD population who sometimes are taking care of children, and so they're not considered a caregiver because they're not the primary caregiver in some cases, but they have some responsibility for children. So having them lose SNAP benefits would take resources away from a family with kids. So I think that is something that certainly is a concern.
Okay, Ms. Cunningham?
Sure. Well, another population that would be affected are non-custodial parents. So not only grandparents, but if you're looking for non-custodial parents to contribute to their children's well-being, it's important that they have a job. It's important that they're supported while they're looking for a job.
Unexpected consequences. I've got about 23 seconds.
Unexpected consequences. Non-custodial parents are critical to the well-being of their children, and so we want to support them.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Desjardins, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We live in a country that takes care of people who can't take care of themselves, and that's the right thing to do. The SNAP program is there to help people who are hungry, make sure that they have food in their mouths and that hunger is reduced, and it's our responsibility in Congress to make sure that we have the funding to take care of those in need. Thankfully, our economy is doing much better. Unemployment, as mentioned in your opening statement, Mr. Adelson, is at 50-year lows. And in fact, in my home state of Tennessee, about the only thing holding back economic growth is an adequate workforce. So I think it's fortuitous that we're having this hearing today that Mr. McGovern had asked for. It seems like we probably agree on a lot of things that we're just not even seeing here. The fact that able-bodied people who can work, should work, I think is a pretty common concept. I asked Secretary Perdue when he was here last month if he had any idea why there's so much pushback to this idea, and he responded, I have no clue. I can understand that when you look statistically that across all political spectrums, about 80% of people believe that able-bodied people who can work should work. So we just have to figure out how to get that done. And I guess I'd like to ask our witnesses, in concept, do you agree that able-bodied people who can work should work? And we'll start at this end.
Yes, I agree. It's best for everyone, for the individuals.
Okay, Mr. Adelson.
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I do.
So that's a great place to work from. We all agree that that should happen. And the problem is, how do we do that? And we've heard of all kinds of barriers that stand before us. And, so it's our job to solve that. Mr. Adelson, within the framework of the existing funding for employment and training, what changes have been made to increase the effectiveness of those funds? Or how are we making it easier for people to find work and transition into the workforce?
Sure. Well, the funds and programs you mentioned, Congressman, are really critical, and we can't leave that piece out. We put a lot of money into employment and training, not just in the SNAP program, but also across the board, as was mentioned. We have adult ed, community colleges, DOL, career one-stops. There's a lot of resources designed to help these precise individuals. And for them to really be effective, the key is that people actually utilize them. And we have seen problems where when these programs are purely voluntary, there's no type of requirement in place, there's been very little participation. And what we really want to see is these folks utilizing all those great resources that are being provided. And so I think that's one of the key values of the work requirement being in effect, is it connects them to those resources, where otherwise we're just loading the EBT card every month and we're not really working with them on getting back to work. Some of the places where it's been really effective recently, there's been a real urgency on connecting folks to a job and getting them taking that first step. We saw in Florida in particular, a lot of people took an initial first step and maybe landed at a temp agency or in fast food or retail, but that was just the first step. They quickly moved on to higher paying industries with more wages. So the best way to make these programs effective is to get them in the door.
Right. And it seems at these hearings we always hear the best case scenarios from one side and the worst case scenarios from the other side, and I've heard that here today. You can be the group that wants to talk about successes, you can be the group that wants to talk about failures. I want to be the group that talks about successes, and we want more successes. Some of the other witnesses have talked extensively about all the barriers for able-bodied adults joining the workforce. Do you agree that these barriers are as bad as they say, or are you more optimistic?
Congressman, I think in my experience at the agency, that was one of the things that was most disappointing, is the whole system was revolved around this point of view of what people can't do. And I think it's really important that we flip that, and when someone walks through our door asking for help with the food benefit, right away we say, all right, here's your benefit. What can we do to get you moving forward? What are you able to do? Where can we help you maybe remediate some skills, things we talked about? But we really need to come at it from the point of view that these individuals are very capable. They can work, they can improve their skills, their education, and meet them at that point instead of starting right off the bat by having a long list of everything they can't do moving forward.
Well, I would agree. I think that we need to try to succeed, not just accept failing. And thank you for your testimony, all of you, for being here. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Schreier, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you to all of our witnesses. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I wanted to first just repeat some of the really interesting things that I heard because I think they really deserve emphasis. So one was that I believe it was you, Mr. Shamba, who said, work requirements keep people out of SNAP but have little to no effect on employment. And I thought that was a really profound statement. Then another that I believe you said it, but others said it as well, was that the able-bodied workers without dependents is really a misnomer, that it misses a lot of people with undiagnosed mental illness, learning disabilities, and people on the autism spectrum who really are not truly able-bodied. I thought another really important point was that the average benefit is $1.40 per meal. And I think about how we are nickel and diming over this benefit that is providing nutrition to people in need. I heard that only 1.5% truly don't want to work, which is a small number, and in my opinion, not enough to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And that the unemployment rates just don't paint a true picture because the skill sets needed may not match where the job openings are. I wanted to talk a little bit about the state of Washington. So the state of Washington is firmly committed to improving the lives of those on SNAP through work by helping beneficiaries become self-sufficient through good-paying jobs. In fact, in 2018 alone, the state spent $22 million of its own money on top of federal funds on SNAP employment and training programs, otherwise known as SNAP ENT. And making this investment among the top 5 states in the country. And in addition, we were granted one of 10 SNAP ENT pilots that were funded in the 2014 Farm Bill. In 2016, our Assistant Secretary for Economic Services, David Stillman, testified before this committee about our state's successful education and training program. And under his leadership, the best practices learned are now being shared with others throughout the country. We have also engaged employers like Amazon, Microsoft, Providence Health, and others to be active partners in this training program. And the bottom line is that that part is working, and we know what we're doing. Now, the proposed rule will completely undermine all of that work. Our governor agrees, and in fact, I'd like to enter into the record Governor Jay Inslee's letter of comment on the proposed rule because it talks about the devastating impact that this will have on our state's 91,000 ABAWDs. I had a question for Ms. Hamler-Fugitt, which is this. In Washington, we estimate that more than 43% of our state's ABAWD populations currently experience homelessness, disproportionately higher than the broader SNAP population in the country at 11%. Nearly 60% of our ABAWD population is suffering from behavioral or physical health conditions, including substance use disorder. For these individuals, the USDA proposal would do nothing to help them find work, while adding yet another obstacle in their way, which is in food insecurity and hunger. And the proposed rule would not achieve the goal of promoting self-sufficiency, and jobs would make it more difficult to find employment. So how does this description fit your experience in Ohio?
To the Congresswoman, very similar, except Washington State is to be commended for your commitment of $22 million of state general revenue fund to expand your program. Again, Washington residents are very fortunate to have that kind of leadership. Unfortunately, it's the luck of the draw. Other states or counties, in our situation, a county-devolved system, that's up to local county commissioners. So I would say it's very similar. One final remark. What's really missing from this is a standardized set of data. We need to be measuring the same thing. The assessments should be standardized across all states on the information upon intake. These are not social workers that are doing this intake. These are clerks. They are not qualified to make determinations about one's mental or physical disabilities.
I appreciate that comment, especially as a medical professional myself, that these can be difficult diagnoses to make, and that we need to consider the rate of undiagnosed everything, including learning disabilities in certain populations. Mr. Shamba, I had a question for you, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this excerpt from Governor Inslee's letter. While the unemployment rate does provide essential data, it does not take into account a community's individualized workforce needs, or that its residents may not be well suited to find and keep locally available jobs due to a lack of housing, hard skills, certifications, and employers in that part of Washington.
I think that's exactly right, and I think one thing that's important to recognize is even when the aggregate unemployment rate is low, it doesn't mean it's low for all groups or in all areas. As mentioned, in some places it's as high as 10%. When it first crossed under 7% nationally, it was still 10.7 for people with less than a high school degree. So there are some people who are going to be struggling a great deal even when the overall rate is low.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you very much. Now recognize Mr. Hagedorn for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Ranking Member. Appreciate the opportunity. Thanks for this hearing, witnesses. This is an issue that has been important to me for over 30 years. I used to work for Congressman Arlen Stanglin, who was a member of this committee, and he and Congressman Stenholm of Texas at that time introduced bipartisan work for welfare legislation in the 1980s. And we had broad support. Couldn't get a vote from the majority party at that time. But a few years later, Newt Gingrich and some others picked up the provisions of that bill and passed it 3 times, finally made it to the president's desk where he'd sign it. And the Clinton-Gingrich, however you want to put it, welfare reform bill was highly successful. We drove down the cost of government. We empowered people and got them back into private sector work. I think most people would recognize, including even President Clinton, that was quite a success. But over time, those work requirements have been winnowed away, and we've had some issues with waivers and things of that nature that they've, some loopholes that need to be closed. And, in my district, we went around and we talked to all sorts of thought leaders, including mayors and social workers and others, and time after time, I was told there are people on the sidelines who could work, but for a number of reasons are not working, and it isn't all, I've never used the word lazy. That comes from the other side. Sometimes there are impediments, they lose benefits and so forth as they get in the workforce, and we need to look at that. But, the chairman himself, Chairman Peterson, who, interestingly enough, succeeded my old boss, Congressman Stanglin, in 1990, he's made comments to say that these waivers aren't working, particularly in the state of Minnesota. And he's talked not just here in committee, but in press as well. And I'd ask any of you, does anybody disagree with the chairman's comments as it refers to the state of Minnesota and these waivers? Anyone? I guess not. Okay, so we have some uniformity on that. What I'd say is this. Work for welfare is a concept that's empowering for people. It's a fairness issue for the taxpayers, because if people are able-bodied to work, they should do so just like the taxpayers do to make it possible. It eliminates fraud. It drives down the cost of benefits. Now, if we want to talk in a serious way about helping folks, let's talk about the concept of transition wages. So when people are moving from welfare into the workforce and they reach that cliff where they're going to lose medical benefits and other things, how do we transition them to keep them in private sector work so they can continue to be upwardly mobile? That to me is important. I hope the chair and others will work with me on those issues. Technical training. I mean, there's lots of jobs out there that are just begging. And we have to look at people's potential. And that's the highest calling. What is the potential of each individual? Not just able-bodied folks, disabled people, people that want to be in the workforce and contribute. What is their potential? We have to have confidence in them and do whatever we can in order to promote that. And lastly, I talked with the secretary was here a few weeks ago. He talked about this regulation. And I told him, in my opinion, I was on a record, that it's God's work, because I think it's moving people in the right direction. It's showing confidence in folks, and it's not allowing states to cut them short and to do that. And I just say to my friends on the other side, if you don't like this regulation, you think the executive branch has gone too far, then join us in enacting the REINS Act. Let's make sure that every regulation coming out of the executive branch has to receive the vote of the House and the Senate and be affirmed before it goes live. That's only fair for all industries. With that, I'd yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Hayes, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In my home state of Connecticut, we have 107 towns, including 13 towns in my own district, that would lose the 2018 waivers proposed under this rule. This would translate to about 26,000 people in Connecticut automatically becoming vulnerable to losing the federal help they need to simply put food on their tables. I will say to my friends on the other side that I was a SNAP beneficiary. I worked 2 jobs, was grossly underemployed, and was a full-time college student. It was temporary. It took much longer than 3 months, but it was temporary. So while this 3-month time limit for SNAP benefits for ABAWD in theory should only impact adults who do not have children, in practice, it will inevitably and disproportionately impact children and young people. As a teacher, this damaging impact is personal for me. SNAP is the first line of defense amongst childhood hunger. It's also the first line of defense against economic instability and hunger for young people, especially for the 20,000 kids aging out of the foster care system every year. Madam Chair, I ask that I submit 2 letters into the record, one from the NEA that talks about the effects on young children in the classroom, and the other one from Share Our Strength and No Kid Hungry.
Without objection.
I've seen what a hungry 16-year-old looks like, and it's not much different than a hungry 19-year-old. Hunger is merely a symptom of poverty. The reality is that very few ABAWD recipients of SNAP are not interested in working. Rather, they are desperately underemployed, undereducated, or in low-wage work that is highly unstable. The unemployment rate for young adults is nearly 7%. According to a national survey of youth who aged out of the foster care system, only 12% were employed full-time at age 19. 44% had not obtained a high school diploma or GED equivalent at age 19, leaving them at a significant disadvantage in seeking stable employment and livable wages. Instead of punishing people for being poor or for being in foster care, we need to further invest in job training and education as a way out of poverty so that people can, in fact, help themselves. By ripping away a lifeline of an already vulnerable population, this administration is making yet another unconscionable attack on young people and poor people. This administration is telling this population, one that has already struggled enough, that they don't deserve help the day they turn 18 and age out of the foster care system, that they don't deserve compassion from the federal government, and that they don't even deserve a hot meal. My question is for you, Mr. Schamberg. What are the long-term social and economic effects, cost effects, of ripping away this safety net for food security for young people aging out of the foster care system?
Thank you for the question. We have very good evidence, certainly for children in particular, that spending time in a household with SNAP relative to people in the same economic situation without SNAP benefits has substantial positive impacts on health, income, and earnings later in life. And so I think that would probably translate that type of result to that next population just a few years older, as you mentioned. We know that in many ways you're making investments that make people more employable, better workers, healthier later in life, and in that sense you wind up saving money in the long run.
Well, I appreciate that because I've seen that, because in my experience, these young people do cycle back into the system, and it's not always with SNAP benefits, it's the criminal justice system, it's the unemployment system, it's all of these other programs that could have been prevented if the investment was made on the front end to help them to support themselves. Ms. Hamler-Fugitt, can you think of ways that we can increase outreach so that foster youth or young people who are formerly in foster care know about the benefits that are available to them and are better positioned to help themselves?
One, we need to, Congresswoman, we need to understand that as they're in the foster care system, that they're getting the kind of life skills and support necessary. They're being exposed to opportunities of higher education and training. We need to make sure that there is also transitional benefits. I know our state is continuing to do some more support around a Bridges program that will provide that transition. But again, a lot of these children, as they age out of the foster care system, they're dumped on their 18th birthday onto the street. That's wrong. I know for a fact that we have spent, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of dollars getting these young people to adulthood only to turn our back on them. We can do better. I know we can.
We can do better. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Bacon, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate our 4 folks here today. I appreciate your sharing your perspective. It's a very important topic. And I just want to take a moment to thank Chairman Peterson, who's weighed in on this in recent years, talking about some of the abuses of the state waiver process. So I appreciate his candor, especially his candor coming from the other side of the aisle. The ABAWDs are just that. We're talking about able-bodied adults without young children, and in a time of record low unemployment, 2.7% in Nebraska, I may add, where we have more job openings and people seeking jobs right now, I think there is an expectation by most for folks to seek that work, and there's an expectation of having some time limits within the SNAP program, which there are. And I think there's that expectation there that we should try to enforce that to the best of our ability. And so my question for Mr. Adolphson, if I may, in your studies, have you seen a contrast of those states who are enforcing the time limits versus those who are not, or they're doing the waivers, and helping the ABAWDs get out of poverty? Is there some direct correlation between these individuals who are struggling, but once they get back into the workforce, how does that affect their prosperity or their getting out of poverty? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Congressman, for the question. So what we looked at with those more than 500,000 adults that we tracked individually with their incomes within a year doubled. In Arkansas, we had another year of data, and their incomes tripled within the 2-year period. So what you have is they're actually moving not just up in income, but out of poverty. So the amount they were earning actually replaced the benefit amount as well. So in total, they were earning more than they were before, even when you count the benefit. So we're seeing real upward economic mobility from that population. You contrast that with states where the waiver is in place and there is no work requirement for this population. They're still on the program. By definition, they're still in poverty, right? They're in that income bracket that would keep them eligible. And we know that 3 out of 4 of them aren't working. So we're not seeing that same movement in those states.
Well, thank you. Really, full-time work is the best way out of poverty. And often a year or two later, there's raises and promotions, and it's the first step for getting people out of that poverty area. And I just want to point out in Nebraska, we have such a shortage in some of our more technical career fields, whether it's welding, electrical work. There's a shortage of folks, and They're being offered $40,000 a year jobs in training while they're in training with health insurance just to get them started. And we're having a hard time filling those positions. Anyway, thank you very much. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lawson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome to the committee. A perception of people who are receiving SNAP benefits that extend across America. In dealing with the issue when I was in the state legislature, coming to Congress, was that people were lazy, they did not want to work, you know, they just wanted government assistance. But when you go a little bit deeper into the situation, you find out that this is not true. And listen to your testimony this morning, one would think that because of all of the knowledge that you all have in dealing with people who are receiving SNAP benefits, that we could possibly learn a great deal as lawmakers about how the programs really should be established, instead of some people saying what programs should be without any knowledge of it. I represent an area that has two major urban areas, and the rest of it is rural. And the rural community extend maybe for a distance of about 150 miles between from Gaston County, I like to say from the Chattahoochee River to the St. Johns River in Jacksonville. And in those areas, there's high unemployment and transportation issues where people have difficulty in trying to get into the city. And Florida in itself doesn't utilize the waivers. Now, my question would be simply that food insecurity within college population, student population, which you know have a lot of student population at universities and at the community college, is growing. And not only in the area in Florida, but throughout the United States. Especially at community college, where many of these students are part-time and they're working and trying to make ends meet to really better themselves. Can you discuss any experience that you've had, Ms. Fugitt, that's right, am I saying it right? Fugitt, okay. Or how Association of Food Banks, where part-time students who have benefited from their food stamp status while working hard to complete their degree.
Yes. To the Congressman, yes, that's one of the struggles. In fact, in my written testimony, I talk about Mary, a young woman who is balancing both a pharmacy tech career track at a local community college, trying to work for a drugstore chain, trying to maintain that 20 hours of employment while also assisting her mother to care for her younger sisters. And unfortunately, she fell into a situation where, because the sales weren't there in the store, she wasn't able to get her 20 hours, that then put her SNAP benefits in peril, which then her lifelong dream of becoming a pharmacy tech, the first generation to graduate from high school or from college, was left in the peril where she was looking at having to drop out of college. I also want to say, as Ohio's largest charitable response to hunger, I'm sure that your food banks are in a similar situation. The greatest demand we are currently having is for colleges and universities, both technical schools and four-year institutions, as well as our K-12, to come on site and set up food pantries, not only to feed their students, but also to be able to feed the families of those students as well. Hunger is a problem in America. In my great state, it affects 1 in 6. Hunger looks a whole lot like you and me, and it lives just 6 doors down.
That's incredible, and I noticed that many of the universities now are setting up food banks and working with some of the local grocery exchange. And one would think that once you're in college, and you have this ambition to go to college, that there would be resources there with the financial aid and so forth you get would help you through this. But most of those students who are also receiving financial aid and assistance, I know I have time running out, also have to rely heavily on food banks in the community as well as other people who are working in those communities. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. We will now recognize Mr. Davis. Yeah. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to the panel. You know, I'm starting my 4th term here as a member of the House Ag Committee, and I think we can probably all agree as Republicans and Democrats that, you know, the issue isn't about getting people off of SNAP benefits. The issue is about making sure that people who are on SNAP benefits have access to the jobs that we know are available in this country right now. And I think we can all agree, too, may not be our committee's jurisdiction, that there are some loopholes that still exist within our workforce training programs that perpetuate families staying on SNAP benefits, which is why we have right now 9 million more people on SNAP benefits in this country today when there are 6.1 million jobs available, less than 4% unemployment, than when we had 9.5% unemployment. So today is a day that I certainly hope we can take your testimony and come together and try and find solutions. In the 2018 Farm Bill, obviously a lot of us here in the House wanted to try and close what we saw as a loophole in our workforce investment programs by allowing for investment within SNAP education and training to allow families to go get training for jobs that we know are available in our communities. If we don't do it now when unemployment's at 3.9%, we're never going to do it when unemployment's at 9.5%. Help us come up with some solutions. Help us come up with some solutions to allow families to get money to go back and get training so they don't have to worry about what they can or cannot buy at the grocery store anymore when they're doing everything they can to get a job in our communities that we know that are available. It's very frustrating to me that this debate becomes more about politics than clearly it does about policy. That is a very frustrating point for me as a legislator, and I certainly hope now that we have the other side in charge that we can come up with some solutions, because that loophole in our workforce investment system still exists. And if we do nothing, we're not helping those families who want to get off of SNAP benefits. So that's my point. Being from Illinois, I also have an issue with the waiver process. Following the passage of the 2018 Farm Bill, I sent a letter to our then governor of Illinois, Bruce Rauner, asking what justification that the state of Illinois had to waive the ABAWD time limit in 101 of 102 counties. While individuals should not be penalized if jobs are unavailable, I inquired regarding what steps the state had taken to encourage the SNAP recipients to get training for employment. And the governor's administration at the time claimed a need for a waiver was due largely to administrative burdens, not out of any particular necessity in all of the 101 to 102 counties. Administrative governmental burdens. Again, it's cruel to do nothing to help a system recover. It's cruel not to help families get training for jobs that we know are available even in the rural communities that I serve. That's what's cruel. Now, Mr. Adelson, I got a quick question for you. Why in the world, a state like Illinois, where we have low unemployment, why in the world did our governor ask for a waiver for 101, 102 counties?
Thank you, Congressman. You hit on it already. One reason is it's driven by the workload on their end, or perceived workload on their end. And the other reason is simply to maximize the number of people that are waived. We've heard that explicitly from states. That's what they're doing. They're not looking strategically at where are people actually unable to get work or get into training. They're just looking at how do we maximize this waiver to cover as many people as possible so they don't have to be engaged, which is a problem. That's exactly what the rule tries to do. Is it's not getting rid of the waiver. The waiver exists. It's in federal law. It's just making sure that it can only be used where it's actually targeted. On the administrative side, I heard the same thing in Maine. I've heard it in many other states. Well, That's a lot of work. Well, first of all, that's the job of the government agency. So yes, it's going to take some work. That's the job. On the other hand, it really hasn't proven to be an administrative burden in any way. The systems are all set up to do it because of the 1996 law, and it's work that they're already able to do. And I would just say, Congressman, quickly, I've heard a couple times the mention of college students. There are other ways to meet this requirement other than working part-time, and individuals who are enrolled at least half-time in any recognized school, training program, or institution of higher education are exempt from the requirement. So that really doesn't come into play with this particular population or waiver.
Great point. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Van Drew.
I want to thank you, Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. You know, this is obviously an issue of great concern all across the country and in so many of our communities. And I find an interesting and intriguing part of the conversation is it seems as if we've almost gotten to a point where we're saying we're either going to have programs to train individuals or we're going to give them SNAP benefits. And I don't really believe that's the issue. I believe the issue is that at certain points in people's lives, they need benefits in order to move on to the next point of their life. And that's really the hope and the desire of what we should be doing here. This proposed rule is going to have a major effect in many communities across the country. I come from an interesting district. I'm come from the state of New Jersey, and everybody always assumes because New Jersey is generally a wealthy state with a high per capita income that a lot of these issues don't exist. They exist in our urban areas up north, and they exist in my district, which is 40% of the state. I have 40% of the state. I have 8 counties and 92 towns, much of it rural, much of it seasonal, so we have a lot of shore communities. And what does that all mean? That means that a lot of folks don't have an easy opportunity to find access to full-time good employment year-round. We certainly don't have the type of transportation that makes it easy, and we don't have some of the other amenities. I would point out in one of my deep south counties down in South Jersey, it was only a number of years ago that we got our first county college. So, you know, it's different. It depends upon where you live. It depends on what the issues are. Unemployment is not unemployment everywhere. It's not the same. The numbers don't mean the same, and employment numbers don't mean the same thing everywhere. So in northern New Jersey, if you're in the financial industry, that's a whole different thing if you are picking cranberries down in South Jersey. And I think everybody has to realize that and understand that. So it isn't either or. You can do both. We do have to train people. We do need more transportation. We do need more opportunity. We all want, every single person up here wants everybody to work all the time. That's the goal. But in the process, people fall through the cracks, and that's what we're talking about. Jobs just aren't always as easy to come by as some of the statistics show. One of the interesting parts of this is the administration expects about $750 million of people to lose food assistance under this proposed rule, and probably would save, if my understanding is correct, about $15 billion in federal savings from the cuts presented as a primary benefit of change. But what are the costs, or what is the involvement going to be to those food pantries? So we have food pantries, and I deal with them and I visit them, and there's lots of good people who work real hard. They really are. They're hardworking people. They're just not making as much money. And they go to the food pantry, and that helps them get through while they're trying to educate their kids more, and they're trying to work harder, and they're working their 2 jobs, and God help them, sometimes 3 jobs. They're going to be getting hit more. They are going to have greater requirements upon them. And who's going to fill that? How are we going to take care of that? What's going to happen there? Or do you believe anything's going to happen at these food pantries and these types of facilities that exist out there? And I guess that's a question for Ms. Hamler-Fugitt.
To the chairman, to the congressman, food pantries can't do it. Our food banks in 3,540 member charities are already overwhelmed. 80% of our member charities are faith-based organizations operating on budgets of less than $25,000 a year. They are overwhelmed with the demand, not only from working people who work every day and play by the rules, but aren't earning enough to meet their basic needs. More senior citizens than we've ever seen. We are an aging state. They are the canary in the coal mine. More grandparents raising grandchildren, and now we place this additional burden on top of folks who have lost their SNAP benefits through no fault of their own because they can't find paid employment or work experience opportunity or SNAP employment and training program. We can't do it. SNAP is the first line of defense against hunger in this country, not food banks.
So it is your considered opinion then that we're going to fall short, that they literally are not going to be able to keep up and their shelves at times are going to be empty?
Yes, Congressman, it happens every day in your community, in my community, and across the U.S.
And the last part, I know I'm running out of time here, but I am out of time. I might as well just admit it, right? Thank you, Chair. Oh, and Chair, I have some also, real quick, may I have unanimous consent to enter into the record Feeding America's comments on the proposed rule regarding able-bodied adults without dependents and its impact on hunger and hardship?
Without objection.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Dusty. Appreciate it. Thank you guys for being here. I know it's been a long day, and before I get started, Madam Chair, I'd like to insert a February 19th letter signed by myself and 64 other members in support of the administration's proposed rule.
Without objection.
Thank you, ma'am. I think, you know, as we look at this, I think it's shameful that politics gets involved in this because it shouldn't. We're looking to reform programs that make America stronger. You know, I think our ultimate goal is we want a strong economy, we want strong job markets, we want people thriving and living the American dream. And I'm not going to bore you with my story going from being broke as a church mouse to being on food stamps to where I am today. The programs are there for the people that truly need it, and we want to make sure the integrity of those programs are there. And Florida is one of the many states focused on work-oriented reforms, and a new report shows the incredible impact they're having on our state, as you brought out, Mr. Adelson. Since the state implemented a food stamp requirement, or work requirement in 2016, nearly 94% of able-bodied childless adults have left Florida's food stamp program. Alabama saw 85% reduction, Maine saw more than 80%. And when we talk about able-bodied adults with no dependents, we're talking about a small group of people. And we're looking for no physical disabilities, no mental disabilities, just a small section. And I think if we focus on that, what can we do with these kind of results? What can we do to implement these somewhere else in other states? And I guess the question for the panel is, was there any detriment that you know of people moving off in these states? I'll take Florida since that's where I'm from. Can anybody say, well, since 94% got off of that, there was this massive malnutrition or starvation? Anybody? I'll take that as a no. You were going to say something.
I would just say, I think we do know that if you remove we know what SNAP does to provide food security, and so we know if not everyone is finding jobs, then there are people who are losing resources and are then left with food insecurity.
Oh, is there any evidence that people that moved off of these programs fell into a bigger food insecurity? I mean, is there documented peer-reviewed articles?
There's also, just for the record, absolutely no documented evidence that the people moving to work were moving to work because of the work requirements. The only documented studies that have actually tried to study it carefully by looking at populations that faced work requirements that compared to those that didn't, find literally no impact on the propensity to work based on exposure to work requirements.
But if we have a reduction of 94%, 85% in Alabama, 80% in Maine, we know that's a measurable
We also know, though, that in the places that don't have work requirements, people cycle off SNAP all the time. Even in 2008,
at what percent?
In 2008 to 2012, when the economy was terrible and work requirements were waived almost everywhere, the Department of Agriculture reports that 80% were off SNAP within 2 years, and that's with almost no jobs.
I'm glad you brought that up, because in the late 1990s, the share of Americans living in a country or city away from SNAP work requirements was under 20%. It climbed a bit under George Bush administration to 1/3. In 2009, a waiver program designed to accommodate exceptional circumstances became a national panacea. As part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment signed in by President Obama that February, Congress has temporarily suspended the conditions on ABAWD SNAP enrollees nationwide. The suspension was supposed to extend only through 2010, but no government initiative is temporarily, and 8 years later, ABAWD time limit waivers are still in effect in at least part of or 36 countries. The point that I want to get across is we're at full employment pretty much in this country. And we know prior to the recession, there was about 17, 18 million people on the SNAP programs. With the waivers, it went up to 41, 42 million. It's come down to around 38, 39 million. You know, we should see, I would think, a ratio of decrease with the full employment. And I think we should take the politics out of this. Let's get people into higher paying jobs. As we've seen, there's 6.3 million unfulfilled jobs. In my district, we've got people starting minimum wage, $15 an hour through competition because the economy's so good. Let's maximize that, and let's help people transition off and move from aid to, you know, off on a program, get them educated and off a program. And, you know, I'm out of time, so I got to go. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Panetta, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's good to be here. Ranking Member Johnson, good to see you too. Thanks to all the witnesses for being here, as well as your preparation to be here. I know it takes a lot of work, so thank you very much. First of all, just some housekeeping. I'd like to enter into the record this letter from Maison, a national advocacy organization working to end hunger. It's a pretty extensive letter, almost a 20-page letter that talks about how this proposed rule would cause certain groups like rural Americans, working poor, and veterans to lose out on many of their benefits and the difficulties that they may undergo if this rule is in place. If I could enter that into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And look, I'd also like to, you know, I understand what Mr. Yoho and Mr. Davis are saying, and I agree with them partly, not just because they're my friends, but because I agree that we have to start looking at policy when it comes to this issue. I think we know it can be very political on both sides, And I saw it last term as a freshman member sitting right down there on in the Ag Committee and dealing with the Farm Bill. And the presentation of significant changes to the SNAP program without any significant evidence supporting such changes. And when I sat there and I asked the chairman about the evidence that he had in support of these changes that would actually work, the chairman's response to me was, well, we got 2 years to figure that out. And I believe that on this type of issue, that is very sensitive, that is very important to my 74,000 recipients of SNAP in my district on the Central Coast of California, we don't have 2 years just to figure it out. We need to basically lay a foundation of evidence to do so. Now, part of that's my background. I'm a prosecutor, and I learned that I just couldn't go into court early on as a young misdemeanor deputy and stand up and say he's guilty and sit back down. I had to prove my case with evidence, and then I could make my argument based on that evidence. So I think that's something that obviously we need to do, not just on this committee and the Ag Committee, but not just on this subcommittee. Obviously, it should be something done in Congress, to be frank. I think that's a common sense statement. But I think this is the type of issue where you see the effects, where you see the politics at play. And I just hope moving forward we can continue to look at the evidence to support these types of programs because we want to help people. That's wholehearted. That's important, and that's why we're here. And I think that this type of program, I think we understand that the evidence is missing. And what we are saying is that we can't just base one metric, a 20-hour work week. We can't just use that to tell us everything that we need to know about a recipient of SNAP benefits. We have to look at everything. And unfortunately, I do believe that this proposed rule does just that. It reduces benefits by singling out a group the USDA assumes is less deserving. those who are deemed able-bodied but are unable to work. And I think that we're learning today that there is more to this story about these recipients' stories that meets the eye, and that this proposed rule will harm those with vulnerabilities that we may not be able to see at first glance. And some of those deemed able-bodied, may actually not be, and others may face difficulties we would not otherwise anticipate. That is what this hearing is demonstrating, and why the USDA should rethink this proposal, gather more data, gather more evidence, and learn more about the challenges these targeted SNAP beneficiaries really face. Now, obviously, one of those groups is veterans. In my district on the Central Coast, we have about 30,000 veterans for a number of reasons. But I'd just like to throw out there to Ms. Hamler-Fugitt, basically, with this proposed rule, what would be some of the obstacles that veterans would face in trying to find employment?
To Congressman Panetta, you know, what we see in Franklin County, in our vets population, we have a vets outreach worker that works specifically with this population. We are seeing servicemen and women who have been on multiple tours of deployment returning to the community with a lot of issues, mental health issues, jobs that were promised that are not there for them to transition back into, and a desperate need for mental health treatment as well as the transitional supports and housing supports. So again, prioritizing that. If I could just reiterate what you said about the policy needs to be driven by empirical evidence. We have been having this conversation for more than 20 years since this provision went into the 1996 Welfare Reform Act. And that's one thing that I urge all of you to do, is to set the standard for data collection so we can measure this information, measure the participants, measure their outcomes across all states by using the same data sets.
Outstanding. Thank you. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very, very much. I thank all of you for being here today and your testimony. But as I listen today, the chair recognizes herself for 5 minutes. If I didn't know better, I would think that this was a hearing about waivers. It is not. If I didn't know better, I would think that there were no job requirements or training requirements for ABAWDs. There are. It's the law now. I listened to one of the witnesses talk about what happened in 2006. This is 2019. In 2006, we were a manufacturing society in most major cities in this country. Today, we're more service. And we don't make anything in this country anymore. There was a time you could come out of high school and go into a factory and get a job. That doesn't exist today. Because the same corporations we give big tax breaks to take all of their business and make everything offshore. Yeah, there were jobs in 2006. There aren't today for low-skilled and unskilled workers. Let's just talk about who really are ABAWDs. They're the people who clean these buildings that we work in every day and that some people sleep in every night. They're the people who serve us in the cafeteria, who fix our food in the Those are ABAWDs. They work every single day. And even this government doesn't pay them enough to make a living. There are people who work in this building who qualify for SNAP every month. That $1.40 a meal. Let's talk about what it really is. And let's also talk about jobs. We know that over the next 20 years, 80% of all jobs will require some form of STEM education. Most of the people we're talking about, the poorest of the poor, don't have those skills, don't have that education. There may be jobs, but they don't qualify for them. You know, if I had grown up maybe around a blueberry patch, I might have done that too. There's not one in my neighborhood. My neighborhood is one where people just try to survive every day. I mean, I think that we have to be realistic about who we are talking about. I got into an elevator in this building. A person who cleans the buildings gets on with me, which is not really allowed for them to put their carts on with us. She wanted to tell me in tears how much it meant for her to get the SNAP benefits she gets every month. But no, we want to make this some big deal about being partisan. It's not partisan. Hungry people are hungry people. People who work are people who work. And I think that if we're really honest with ourselves and we started to talk to the people who are in these situations, instead of believing that they are invisible and they are unworthy and undeserving, we might have a different outcome. Maybe we would sit down, as my colleague said here, and find a way to get them to the jobs that are available. Maybe we provide some transportation. Maybe we provide some training, not just filling out an application, actually training them to do a job that exists. If I just didn't know better, I wouldn't even think I'm in this country if I didn't know better. And so I just want to say to all of my colleagues, I know that we all care about the people we represent, but maybe sometimes we need to come out of these buildings and talk to them. Maybe we need to go into a food bank and see who comes. That might be helpful. And not just assume who they are and what they are. And until the USDA can tell me who they are, then I am never going to support something like this. Because not only is it doesn't rely on any data, when they could just wait a little while and get the data from the trials we've already done, but more importantly, because they don't know who they're talking about. They have no idea. And so you just make up something for people. It is time that this Congress, the People's House, the representative of the people of this country, find out what our people want. And with that, I would close and ask my colleague if he has a closing statement. Oh, before that, Chairman Peterson asked that I enter into the record a letter of comment from Commissioner Tony Laurie with the Minnesota Department of Human Services. Without objection.
Yes, it is indeed true that the people who clean this building at night are worthy and deserving. And they are ABAWDs. And of course, it is absolutely true that the people who make the food in the cafeteria, they are worthy and they are deserving and they are ABAWDs. I think it is just as important to acknowledge that they are working and that their work is important and that it is worthy of our respect. They're working. They're doing what they can to try to eke out a living and put themselves in a position where tomorrow can be better than yesterday. Work does that, and if it is, if a couple of things came out loud and clear that there is a basis for agreement, it is first off that people who can work should work. I want to thank the panelists for bringing that to the fore. One other thing that I think came out, particularly with Mr. Van Drew's comments and others, is the importance of data, the importance of evidence. Evidence is powerful, and data can light our way forward, and that's why I'm concerned that there was resistance on the part of some members of this committee to a robust data capture component championed by Chairman Conaway and others during the last Farm Bill discussion. I am hopeful that since we all acknowledge the importance of data, we can work together to have better data capture opportunities in days to come. I would close by saying this, Madam Chair, I have heard that you run a tight ship and a fair one. You do. Thank you for a good hearing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson. I appreciate it, and I appreciate your ability to work with me and willingness to do so. Thank you all very much for being here. I appreciate your testimony. My closing statement. Under the rules of the committee, the record of today's hearing will remain open for 10 days, 10 calendar days, to receive additional material and supplementary written responses from the witnesses to any questions posed by a member. This hearing of the Subcommittee on Nutrition Oversight and Department Operations is adjourned. Thanks.
See you at the UN.
You got it.